School's in session. Come on in. Now, back in the 1880s and pioneer days, the one-room schoolhouse, the boys and the children would file in, the boys would sit on one side of the room, the girls would sit on the other side with the potbelly stove in the back in the middle. School was very formal then. You sat in your chair, your feet flat on the ground, your hands folded on the desk, and you did not move. If you had a question, you had to raise your hand. And then when the teacher called on you, you would stand up. Back then, women teachers were not allowed to be married. They were only hired for one term at a time. They weren't paid very much, and the teachers would do it was called board around with their students, meaning that they would live with the families. Now, it's a one-room schoolhouse because all the grades were together. With the walkers, it was the children of the grandparents and the neighbors who all come to the one-room schoolhouse that was there. They used a barn for the purpose. The children back then, of course, we go to school starting in late summer and continue through spring. But back then, children were expected to work on the ranch. There was planting in the spring and plowing, and in the fall there was a lot of work with the harvest. So as a result, children only went to school in the winter and in the summer. Of course, it wasn't a school bus either. They would walk or ride a horse, sometimes 2 or 3 miles. And in winter, when it got cold, they would have to bundle up. So when they got into the school, the teacher had already been there to start the fire and haul water for the bucket with the one dipper that everyone shared. They would take off their coats and put them under a bench along with their lunch pails. Now, you may want to know why children who worked on the ranch had to have an education. Well, they did. They needed to learn about earnings. They needed to know quantities for everyday purposes, what to buy in the store and what was a fair price. But the subjects were very basic: reading, writing, and arithmetic. Most everything was done by memorization or rote, as it's called. They didn't have many books. They used whatever they could, but a popular book was called the McGuffey's Eclectic Reader, and there were about 6 books, and they were divided into lessons. Each one was progressively harder. Now, back then, penmanship was very important because they didn't have computers. So if they were writing, everything had to be written down, and you had to be able to read someone's handwriting. Also, pronunciation or elocution was extremely important. So the lesson books are divided up by stories, and each story teaches new vocabulary, it teaches pronunciation, and each one has a moral to it, something like, quite often with religious overtones. And so they would learn by standing up and reading a story out loud. And just as an example, I'll read part of this, which you should recognize as I go along. It's called The Wolf. A boy was taking care of some sheep, not far from a forest. Nearby was the village. He was told to call for help if there was any danger. One day, in order to have some fun, he cried out with all his might, "The wolf is coming! The wolf is coming!" The men came running with clubs and axes to destroy the wolf. As they saw nothing, they went home again and left John, the boy, laughing in his sleep. As he had had so much fun this time, John cried out again the next day, "The wolf! The wolf!" Again the men came running, but not so many as the first time. And again they saw no trace of the wolf, so they shook their heads and went back. On the third day, the wolf came in earnest, And you must recognize the stories of the boy who cried wolf. Well, this time the wolf did come and he ate the boy's favorite pet lamb. And the boy was quite sorry for having deceived his friends and neighbors, because when he called the third time, no one came to help. The moral of the story is, the truth itself is not believed from one who often has deceived. Now, not only do we have a moral to the story, this introduces new words. This is from the third McGuffey's Reader. You have wolf, grieved, sleeve, neighbor. You learn how to pronounce that. It shows the way to pronounce it. And also, does this sound like the way we talk now? Like John was laughing in his sleeve. Well, we don't say things like that anymore. We would say, oh, he was chuckling to himself. So the grammar and sentence structure was different back then. The arithmetic they learned was very basic. Adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. But it was, in order to learn it, they took real life situations. And again, this is a new word. When you talk about forenoon, that's before noon, and afternoon is afternoon. So there's a problem. A man driving a wagoner traveled 15 miles in the forenoon and 6 miles in the afternoon. How far did he go that day? Now back then, paper was very scarce, so they used slates and chalk. So the idea is to work out the problem on your slate. If you get 21, 15 plus 6, you have the right answer. That's an addition problem. And then, of course, you have to wipe it off and start with a clean slate. Another problem is that children, when the chores was to haul water into the house. A gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. So if your mother tells you to go out and bring her 4 gallons of water, how much does that weigh? Well, let's work it out on the slate. If you get 32, you have the right answer. So you get the idea of how that would go. Now, of course, children, I'm sure all of the children watching this video are very good children who would never dream of misbehaving, but it sometimes happens. So a form of punishment that, like I said, school was very formal, that you were not to move. You sat there and you looked straight ahead of the teacher, and you were not to talk to your neighbors or anything like that. If for some reason you did not recite well, you were made to wear a dunce hat. If you were doing something else, you could, one punishment was to draw a circle on the wall, and you'd have to stand with your nose in the middle of the circle in front of the class. Another type of punishment, if someone would not pay attention, is to stand in front of the class with your arms outstretched and a heavy book in each hand, and you would stand there. Another form of punishment was to make a boy sit next to a girl. Of course, we don't have things like that these days. Their lunches, they had recess. The lunches were very simple. They would be often fresh fruit and vegetables from the garden, but there would be cheese. There'd be leftovers from the previous meal, like cheese wrapped in a cold pancake and things like that. Quite often, the teachers were not much older than the students. They only went up to about 8th grade, and then people stopped school. So they also learned geography. They learned, they had a map. They would learn, they would do some arts and crafts. It all depended on what was available from the teacher. And then at the end of the class, which I would say is about now, they were allowed to go home. To end the class, there's the Mr. Bell, school is excused. And that is a description of a one-room school in the 1880s.